So welcome back. On the 25th of May, Africa celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Organization of African Unity, now the AU. And as the month of May comes to an end tomorrow, a month during which Africans obviously observe the founding of the OAU, we continue to reflect on the continent's journey and its trajectory amid the commemorations. Jamie Mighti, Africa researcher and political commentator, joins us in studio for a reflection on what has happened in Africa this month. Jamie, so good to have you in studio with us. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
So let's start with Africa Month and what that means, because many people don't observe the month of May as significant and looking at Africa and its issues per se. We know there's the 25th of May, which is Africa Day, when we all come out, in our beautiful African attire. And beyond that, what do we do?
Yeah, so I think we don't have a universal appreciation of Africa Month and Africa Day in the same way that, maybe Americans have of Black History Month. And part of that is because in some countries, Africa Day is not a holiday. So if you were to go to Zimbabwe and other countries, you'd find that the 25th of May is a holiday. So that at least brings some attention to the fact that we stop doing what we're doing and we try to memorialize this day and all of the things that happened and all of the African icons who contributed to making, the independence of African states and the progress of African states a reality. When you don't do that, and when you also don't have a universal teaching of African history and history in the classrooms, that also contributes to a minimalization, so to speak, of the significance of the Pan-African journey as well as the African moment.
So given that we've come quite away from the colonial era in Africa, why is it that we are still struggling to essentially assert in our curricula, for example, teaching African history from the perspective of Africans?
Well, I mean, that's a mixed bag. I think we don't have that kind of prioritization across, because not all of the current political leaders are actually Pan-Africans, and not all of them are actually people who care about education and putting education where it needs to be. In fact, one of the great tragedies of Africa is that we failed to capitalize on trends in education when there was an opportunity. Even if you think about someone like Robert Mugabe, who people say was great at education. Apple Computers became $1 billion company in 1980. Zimbabwe became an independent state in 1980. So if you're the progressive education leader, you would think that you would pick up that, hey, computers are becoming a thing, and try to introduce computers into your classrooms in 1980 as the great educator. But even the great educator missed the first wave of computers. He missed the 90s wave of the email and the internet. There was still no computer science being introduced into schools. And even now, if you look across Africa, coding is not a subject that is universally taught. So when we look at the failure of African leaders to educate, I think that it's something that happens across the board. And then the question would, I guess, be why have they failed to do this?
Exactly, because shouldn't that be the first thing that you address, given the fact that we come from an era where what we are taught, not just history, is basically from a certain perspective. So surely it would be in everybody's interest to get people educated.
Yes, there's an interesting book that answers that question called Why Nations Fail by Darren Asimoglu and James Robinson. And what they show is that African countries inherited extractive economies. Extractive economies needed a few Black people to be well educated and the masses to be undereducated so that they could provide cheap labor on farms, in mines, in shops, etc., etc. So when we took over these extractive economies, which were designed for the benefit of a white elite under colonial periods and designed for the benefit of the colonial powers, such as Germany, such as Britain, those systems needed to be redesigned and made inclusive economies. And to have an inclusive economy, you need to redesign your education system so that everybody in that system has an opportunity to attain any educational outcome that they're willing to work for. So when we got into this independence era, what you find, and I think South Africa is an example of that as well, is that there was not deliberate attention paid to the fact that in 1953, the Bantu Education Act was enacted with a specific intention to undereducate black people so that they would not be able to access particular jobs, so that they would remain, as Vavud said, hewers of water. So that needed to be changed. And unfortunately, it was not changed. And we saw with the proficiency in reading test that came out that right now only 1% of people in grade 4 are reading at an advanced level, and only 19% are reading at any level that is, considered to be acceptable, and that is at the very low level. But if you were to look at how many people are reading at an intermediate level worldwide, that number is 90%. In South Africa, it's only 7%. So those failures to open the corridors of learning actually affect the prospects of Africa downstream.
And again, you can't help but ask the question, what are our leaders thinking? Because what were all these struggles for on the continent if, when people then attain their freedom, it seems to be more of the same, and in some instances worse than before?
Yes, Sakina, I've thought about this many times, and I think that one of the answers is that there are two types of people as they age. There are people who age and remain young at heart and competitive and hungry for progress. And there are those who basically give up. Unfortunately, I think that Africa has a collection of elders who gave up along the way. And that's why sometimes I think we may need to look at this generational divide, because when I look at the elders in their 70s who are running these countries, President Ramaphosa, Mnangagwa, you look at Museveni, you look at Bola Tinubu, who just came in, or Paul Biya, I don't think that there is any urgency, because they don't, one, experience the challenges that are being faced by young people and people who are of middle age. But number two, I think that they've accepted that this is as far as they can go.
But these septuagenarians are not electing themselves. So what's wrong with the populace, the masses of Africa?
Well, it's a mixed bag, right? So we have to separate that. We've got a few real democracies in Africa where you have real elections, where people are electing. And sometimes that's reasonable. Maybe if you look at the South African example, there were real expectations that, a billionaire businessman would be able to, fix some of the institutional problems and fix the system, so to speak. Obviously, there's maybe some disappointment around the accomplishments on that side. But a lot of the African countries do not have democracies. And that's part of the problem. You see, when you have these extractive economies, they often come with extractive political systems which are based on corruption and violence. If you were to look at Zimbabwe, it is a dictatorship. You look at Uganda, there are no free and fair elections, and they've just been passing some very draconian measures. If you look at Cameroon, for example, where Paul Biya has been running it like it's his personal family business since 1982, all of those spaces, the youth do not really have recourse to actually choose their own leadership. And that is one of the great tragedies of Africa, is that where there were opportunities to remedy that, for instance, maybe in 2008 in Zimbabwe and maybe even in 2017, the African community chose stability over actually allowing the democratic aspirations of people to choose a new leadership to take them a different direction.
Well, isn't that the real issue? We only have 2 minutes left, Jamie, but isn't that the real issue? Because, you talk about dictatorships, but we are told that these countries went to elections and governments were elected. So, isn't that the real problem, where the leadership, the leaders across Africa choose to turn a blind eye when they shouldn't?
It's a big part of the problem. And the global community often follows that line of messaging. I think one of the things we need to stop doing is to normalize elections which were unfairly won. And we need to actually cast a light on unfair electoral practices, cast a light on dictatorships and, light dictatorships, whatever we may think.
But who must stop that?
We're doing it now. We're
not doing it. We're having a conversation and hopefully, elevating this particular topic and some of the problems. But the people who have the power, you would imagine they are the ones who have to stop it.
Well, the people who have the power, unfortunately, are not doing us right in terms of speaking up against dictatorships. We have dictatorships in the SADC region, and people still act as if, there's a legitimate government in Zimbabwe, for example. We have to now start calling it as we see it and calling a spade, because even in South Africa, the consequences of the dictatorship in Zimbabwe have been that South Africa has had to provide services for two countries, and that has created strain on the South African fiscus, that has created tensions, and that has actually undermined the Pan-African goal of integration and working together. Because if you have a dictatorship next door and everyone runs to the other side, that creates social issues. And if you don't address that honestly at an election period, you perpetuate that kind of oppression.
But as you said, very often the leaders look the other way because they choose a relative peace and stability. So, Jamie, that's all we have time for, unfortunately. We're going to have to leave it there. Jamie Mighti, Africa researcher and political commentator. And we're just reflecting on the continent as we come to close Africa Month, which is, of course, tomorrow. So that's also all we have time for here on Morning Live.